there's a report that the Jets are very interested in Roger Saffold, who is the top left guard on the free agent market. And if the Jets want Roger Saffold, he will be with the Jets.
Because they have a lot of money.
Exactly. Because they just have $100 million in cap space to buy whatever offensive lineman the Jets want to buy. And this is where the situation gets very, very tricky. And even though there are great players projected to be there at 18, I keep feeling more and more like it's going to have to be a safe offensive lineman pick, because I don't know how else they're solving these problems with everyone keeping their offensive lineman or being able to outbid the Vikings.
The way the guard market, let's just start with the guard market. The way that that's going to pan out is going to determine what they do at 18, in my opinion, because all of the stuff that we've heard coming out of last week and even before then about who would be projected to go at that position, because it's not a top 10 pick. That's not somebody that you can automatically snap your fingers and expect will be a plug-and-play starter and somebody who can make an immediate impact. But as that guard market either thins out to the point where guys are staying with their teams, getting repaid once the new league year starts, or going elsewhere, the Vikings are going to have no choice but to go all in on offensive linemen right away, because you can't afford to wait to the second round at that point.
The way things are shaping up, it almost would even feel like trading back and trying to get as many offensive linemen in the draft as they possibly could if they can't land any of these top targets. There will still be several players who are starters, but how they fit, I'm not sure. Matt Paradis, the center for the Denver Broncos, but that would mean paying him a lot of money and moving Elflein. Right, moving Elflein.
Do you really want to do that?
And also, where is some of the space coming from? And it seems that teams are better at spotting these under-the-radar scheme fit types of guys, or better at keeping them when they work out, like Mike Person did in San Francisco or Mark Glowinski in Indianapolis. So now it's kind of down to them either paying someone through the nose, which then they have to create the rest of the cap space, or just trying to draft people and plug them in. There's also the option to bring back Nick Easton,
which I do think they will do.
I think they will too.
I do think. I mean, I think we got good confirmation of that really through the lines with Mike Zimmer. They like what they have in him. He's difficult for defensive linemen to go against. He makes that second level interior push happen. I do think that at least they've got one spot shored up, and he's been cleared. That's what Mike Zimmer confirmed to us, not as far as the details of what his neck injury is going to either when he'll be back. If we don't know if he'll be back for OTAs or when for camp, but he did say he was cleared medically. So that's a good sign. So you're really then working with one other spot, I think, which if you're the Vikings, that's probably really good news for you, that you'd just be looking at that right guard spot to shore that up somehow. And I think you could do that via the draft.
They could do that in the first round, possibly. They could also try to draft a tackle, move Brian ONeill to the left side and Riley Reiff inside. And we're going to talk about all these different options with Brandon Thorn.
Yes, I'm excited to get his take on that and Jonah Williams.
Talking with Brandon, right?
But I've always listened to him on the show. I think he's been great. And
he does the welcome in. My favorite offensive line analyst, Brandon Thorn. He hosts the Trench Warfare podcast. And I can tell you, I've listened to every episode. He's got interviews with TJ Lang and Joe Staley and Frank Ragnow. Really, really awesome insight into what it's like to live life as an offensive lineman. And we welcome Brandon Thorn to the show. How are you, Brandon?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. This is awesome.
So we've been looking up and down the free agent lists, looking for guys that might fit with the Vikings. Two of them who you suggested for the Vikings, Mark Glowinski and Mike Person, have re-signed with their teams. This morning, Donovan Smith re-signs with his team. What is left for the Vikings now, Brandon, on the free agent market for the Vikings to look at?
Yeah, so I think you have to really look at the interior, specifically a guard. And there is a guy like Roger Saffold out there, although he's going to be probably really expensive. So I don't know how realistic that's going to be. Aside from him, I really think re-signing Nick Easton would be a smart move to bring him back as competition at guard, and then look to probably the draft, honestly, and look at a guard there, because free agency right now, it's getting thin quickly, especially if you want to talk about a scheme dependent guy, or a guy that really fits into that outside zone, the scheme that you guys are going to be running. So I think the draft is probably the best bet.
And coming out of the combine, we heard a ton of buzz about, potential prospects. Jonah Williams' name, to me, I think is the most intriguing, and just hearing his interview about not wanting to move inside at Alabama. I guess that was a conversation. Really, how much, that came to fruition? Not much. I mean, the thing was that he was supposed to move to center. Didn't happen, but now he's projected, I think, just because of his length. Maybe he's a little bit short. If he's there at 18, what do the Vikings get in a guy like Jonah Williams? Because, I don't think he will be there at 18 personally. But is this the right type of fit where they've kind of had this trend recently where they've either moved guys in on their own or they've drafted them and moved them out of position? Do you think that would be the right fit if they are, as you said, able to bring back Easton at left guard and then potentially plug this guy in at right guard?
Oh, yeah. If Jonah Williams is there, I think he should stay at left tackle, but honestly, I think he could play at any position on the offensive line and do it at a high level just because his technique is so refined at tackle, and he does things well that you need at guard, such as hand usage, his anchor is strong, things like that. I think he has plenty of strength to do that as well. So even though I do stand for him as a left tackle, I don't see any issue at all with him making that transition inside. And if he's there at 18, I think that would be an absolute steal. I don't see that happening because even though his arm length is a little bit low, it's not that 34 benchmark that teams seem to like. There's plenty of examples of guys with 33 and change arm length that are succeeding at a very high level in the NFL right now. Jake Matthews, Ryan Ramczyk, Mitchell Schwartz, David Bakhtiari, Joe Staley, Dwayne Brown, Jason Peters. There's so many guys that are under 34. So I think he actually had a really good measurement for him in terms of arm length. I think it's going to be long enough to quell some of those concerns at tackle for a lot of teams. But yeah, ultimately, if Minnesota can get Jonah Williams out of this draft and put him at guard, that would be great. And honestly, I think he's better left tackle day one than Riley Reiff. So I don't even know if he would move inside. But again, if you're drafting him and you want to just fill holes, then yeah, that would be phenomenal, I think.
What would make him fall? That's the conversation that I'm curious about, because I don't, as I said, I don't think he'll be there at 18, just given some of the projections that we've seen. But if he does fall out of the top 10, is it length? Is it because if this is a guy who's got 43 starts at left tackle at Alabama and someone that, if you trust the tape and you trust what you're seeing, he can play multiple spots in the offensive line, what would make him possibly available? And if he's there at 14 or 15, I think if you're the Vikings, you have to consider trading up to get him.
Yeah, I do totally agree with that last point. And as far as what would make him drop, I honestly don't know. You look at the Clemson tape last year when he was going against a really good edge rusher. He lost a couple reps, and you could say that might have been because he let the guy get into his chest. But if you look at that one rep that he lost that everybody's talking about where he got kind of knocked back, he's actually attempting to snatch that guy's arms off the snap and really club down on his arms. And he was just trying something new really on that rep, and it just kind of backfired on him. If you look at his tape across his career, especially the last 2 years at left tackle, because he played right as a freshman, he was phenomenal. He has the best tape, I think, of the last 2 years of any guy that's come into the draft at left tackle. He doesn't have ideal measurements. So, the average left tackle, I think, drafted in the top 10 since 2007 has really hit that 34 mark in terms of guys being drafted that high. So maybe because he doesn't fit into the box that the NFL wants the top 10 tackles to fit in, that could be a reason, I guess, just from a physical standpoint. But if you look at tape and just his technique, he's such a clean prospect in my mind. And then you look at all the off the field stuff, work ethic, football character, all that stuff is just really, really good. So yeah, I think it's kind of odd how we've heard a lot of move to center talk. I think some of it might be somewhat smoke screens because maybe some teams do really like him and they're trying to send out signals that maybe he's not good enough or something like that to kind of deflate his stock a little bit. But in my mind, I think he's worthy of that top 10 talk. And yeah, I think Minnesota, if he gets outside the top 10, a team like Minnesota would be smart to look to trade and get him.
It is smokescreen season, by the way. Brandon Thorn joining us. He is the host of the Trench Warfare podcast, in which he talks with NFL offensive linemen. They break down their craft. It is extremely football, so I highly suggest it. But you know what's really cool, too, about the podcast? Before I ask you another question, I'll just give you a pub here, is that it's also the stories of a lot of guys who overcame things. I mean, Joe Staley was not like a high draft pick or anything and was not the ideal size or weight, and he came out and has made a great career for himself. So I love that you go through their stories and not just their pass sets and things like that. But going back to Nick Easton, Brandon, he's an intriguing guy because he's coming off an injury and he is a free agent. The Vikings would know best what he does well and why he would fit in. What have you seen from his 2017 tape? And do you think that he would fit in to the type of zone system that they're going to run with Gary Kubiak?
Yeah, so I think he's a really good fit into that scheme because what I've seen from him over the last couple of years, specifically 2017, was he really excels running outside zone concepts and even inside zone concepts, working combo blocks with the center and climbing to the second level, taking really good angles out there so he doesn't overrun or undershoot guys. He does a good job fitting smaller, more athletic guys in space, which is a big thing in outside zone schemes. He plays with really good competitive toughness on top of that. He's a guy, I think, who plays with the right mentality up front, and you could really jumps off the film when you watch him. I think he just hasn't obviously been able to put it together due to injuries and things like that, but he's young enough and cheap enough, I think, to where he's a really good option to see how he does in this scheme. The familiarity there with the line that's in Minnesota as well, I think, is a plus. So, yeah, I think Easton is a guy that I'm really intrigued by, especially in this scheme. So I think his value is probably as high in Minnesota as it is anywhere else.
So I'm sure you might have addressed this either with Matthew or any other offense. Somebody wants to talk about offensive line, but I know it's come up on our show for a while about Riley Reiff, and you mentioned it, potentially moving inside. Why would that work? Because when I try to wrap my brain around this, and somebody who hasn't played guard since he was in college, which was nearly a decade ago, why would that move work to put him inside at left guard? Does that not feel like you're still piecemealing the offensive line? Maybe you do move Nick Easton to right guard. Just I don't know. It just seems like there's too many moving parts here. Why would that work for Riley Reiff? And I guess what's the caveat to that?
Yeah, so I think it would work just because I think the way that Reiff has won when he has been at the top of his game in his career is with being strong at the point of attack, playing with really good toughness and physicality. I think his anchor is pretty good when he's able to be in position prior, and he's obviously healthy. Those are areas that I think, I think back to, was it 2016 at right tackle with the Lions, and even last year or 2 years ago with the Vikings. Just when we've seen him do well, I think those are the areas that he wins at. And those are areas generally that you have to be strong at guard as well. And so I think that he could make that transition and be solid there. Not saying, he's going to be in consideration for the Pro Bowl or anything, but I think you could get by for another year or two with that move. But again, I think you're right on with it being sort of a piecemeal type thing. And ideally you don't want to do that. I think it can work, but ideally you'd probably keep him at left tackle another year and just try to fix up that interior on its own, and then eventually look to replacing Reiff with a true left tackle. I think that's probably the best way to go about things.
Brandon, when I'm looking at the draft and free agency, center seems to be a position where there are some very good players. Matt Paradis, and in the draft, Garrett Bradbury took a lot of people back, I think, with his athleticism and strength at the combine. Would it make any sense for the Vikings to bring in a center and move Pat Elflein to guard, where he did play quite well at Ohio State? Or do you think that they should leave Elflein at center and kind of see how things work out with a better situation going into this year, rather than some of the things that he faced last year?
I think you probably keep him at center. Ideally, you keep him at center and you draft a really good right guard and keep Easton a left guard. I think that interior would get me the most excited It would be the least intrusive. I think you would have to do the least amount of changes up front in that scenario. And I think Bradbury could potentially play guard, although I like him more at center. A guy like Eric McCoy could play guard. I like him most at center. And then you even have a guy like Jenkins from Mississippi State who could play. He's played all four positions, or he's played four positions in college, and he took snaps at left guard, which is the one position he hasn't played at the Senior Bowl. So that's a guy who's really intriguing because he has that positional versatility. But I see him probably predominantly as a center. So those three guys jump out to me. And then other right guards, I mean, later in the draft, I think you have some options as well. Drew Samia is a guy I like a lot from Oklahoma. He's about 6'5", 300 pounds. I don't know if he necessarily tested great in Indianapolis, but when you watch him on film, I really like his tape. That's a potential option later on. And then there's a couple of those right tackles like Cody Ford and Dalton Reisner who could slide inside, in my opinion, and be very good there as well. Although I think you ideally, like Jonah Williams, keep them at their college position. Those are guys that are intriguing to me to play right guard as well. So I think that there's a lot of options in this draft, whether you're talking about the first round, day 2, day 3. I think you have a couple different ways to go about doing this.
Hey, last thing for you, Brandon. Let's say that I told you Brian ONeill made the Pro Bowl next year. How did that happen? How does he go from point A, where he is now, showing potential, great athleticism, to being a player who maximized that athleticism and became a above average to really good starter? What's the path there for Brian ONeill?
So I wouldn't be that surprised by that, honestly, because, as you know, I liked him a lot coming out in the draft. But I think what he needs to do is get stronger at the point of attack, specifically in pass protection with his anchoring. That's the main issue I see with him. And it's not all just pure strength, although I think that's a significant part of it. I think that he has to get a lot better with his hands, specifically his hand placement, not getting too wide at the point of attack and letting guys into his chest. Because, if you're going to allow a guy who's converting speed to power off the edge get into your chest, it doesn't really matter how strong you are. That's a very difficult position to recover from and regain your balance and re-leverage yourself. So I think getting more accurate, getting his timing down with his hand strikes and the way he uses his hands so it's more accurate in the center of the rusher's frame, I think that'll go a long way to making him a better pass protector as well. But I think this scheme is a great fit for him. It's going to really accentuate his athleticism and play speed. So, I think he's in a really good position right now to continue the trajectory that I really saw him being able to attain, like coming out of Pittsburgh. I really liked what he could be. So, but yeah, he's really going to have to improve his strength in his hands and pass protection, I think, because we saw that last year. There's way too many times where he just got blown up by guys who aren't necessarily like that great either. So he really needs to get better in that area.
Football, Brandon.
Re-leverage himself.
Oh, man.
My brain's about to explode from all this football talk. I love it.
Maybe the most football moment in the history of our show that is based around football. So